If you thought I forgot about Aristotle after a couple of fancy interviews, then you're mistaken. So here we go. How do our ideas about fairness or freedom quietly shape everything that we build together? Hello, friends, and welcome back to Aristotle's Politics. Today I'm going to summarize Book 6. Aristotle is doing something subtle in Book 6 of Politics that we haven't seen in the previous segments. He slides away from grand theory and gets right down to the anatomy of shared rule. What keeps it alive, what corrupts it, and what sort of people fit what sort of constitutional arrangement. Sometimes you might see me sounding technical at times, but underneath all these classifications, Aristotle is hunting for something universal about human behavior that can be applied in practice. If you enjoy these episodes, make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or follow and leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or other podcast platforms where you might have been listening to this. You can find this show on all major platforms. And for daily content, follow me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. And if you missed the earlier episodes, check them out as they all connect together. So in this episode, I'm going to walk through Book 6, chapter by chapter. I'm going to extract the big ideas and preserve the structure and spirit of Aristotle's main argument. So let's go. Aristotle opens Book 6 with a reminder that there isn't just one form of shared rule. There are different variations of the deliberative body, variations of the groups that hold authority, and variations on how offices are arranged. He notes that the same complexity applies to judicial settings as well. And if all that wasn't enough, there are also different causes of preservation and destruction of each form of rule. But here we want to focus on something more specific, the many kinds of what we might call democracy, or what Aristotle would refer to as popular rule. What Aristotle means is the version of governance where the many rather than the few hold most of the authority and shape the decision making. Two main points on differences in democracies. Firstly, people are different, if you didn't know it before. A farming population doesn't function like a laboring population or a herding population. And adding one group on top of another doesn't just change the quality of governance. It will also end up changing the type of the governance. And interestingly enough, and add enough differences and you end up realizing that you don't have the same regime anymore. Then he adds the second cause of variation. Certain features are different everywhere, things like choosing officials in a particular way or having certain bodies decide major questions. Combine these features differently and you get new subtypes. The key point is this: popular rule is not one thing. And if you mix ingredients differently, you get different outcomes. This is where he ends the chapter. This was basically an introduction to the Book 6. Chapter 2 is where things get spicy. Here, Aristotle says that the defining premise of popular rule or democracy is freedom itself. And the people who support this idea treat the freedom as very substance of their life. Freedom means two things simultaneously according to Aristotle here: being ruled in turn and ruling in turn. So it's a cycle where no one has a permanent claim over authority all the time over all matters. He then ties this straight into their notion of justice. Justice in this context is based solely on numbers. If each person counts for one, then the conclusion follows that whatever the majority resolves is considered just in these systems. Aristotle says that this is an argument from math rather than what is ultimately just, objectively just. Something very interesting and timeless here is that Aristotle says that, and simply because those with modest means will always form the numerical majority, simply out of the sheer case of high numbers, they naturally hold more influence in decisions in these kinds of settings. Because on average, the poor will be numerically higher than those people in the middle. So you can imagine that if modest decisions end up getting decided, you can see the direction of the city and the kind of decisions that they end up taking. Aristotle further lists what follows from this logic: choosing officials from the entire body of citizenry, everyone ruling over each and each ruling over all. Offices selected by lot whenever the special expertise is not required. It is a world built on the idea that every citizen has an equal slice of authority by virtue of simply being a citizen. That is the characteristic of popular rule according to Aristotle. Equality, properly understood within the system, means that neither the wealthy nor the poor rule alone. It is not meant to be domination by the many any more than domination by the few. Equality here is numerical balance, where each person's vote counts the same, and the outcome reflects the aggregated will rather than any particular group. In their eyes, that balance is what secures both equality and freedom. Freedom because no one is permanently subordinated, and equality because everyone contributes to decisions in more or less the same similar proportion. Overall, Aristotle says that this captures the mindset of those that favor popular rule. They see freedom and equality inseparable, and a mechanism of majority decision making as a natural way to protect both. Here again, Aristotle identifies two aspects of freedom. First, the idea that ruling and being ruled in turn is itself considered a freedom. It is kind of equal participation in decision making. Secondly, the idea that freedom means simply living as one wishes. He notes that people associate compulsion with servitude. So freedom becomes the exact opposite of this servitude, according to Aristotle. The ability to shape one's life without external constraints. From these two principles come a whole cluster of characteristics of these regimes, according to Aristotle. He lists them carefully. First, selecting officials from the entire body of citizens. Second, everyone participating in decision making. Third, choosing many positions by lot. Fourth, keeping offices short in duration. Fifth, making sure no one holds the same position twice unless absolutely necessary. Sixth, giving authority to assemblies composed of many people, and when possible, providing pay so that attendance becomes feasible for those with limited means. Aristotle also says that in popular systems, the opposite of what wealthier or more established groups value tends to be emphasized. In other words, the system aligns with the origins of modest ambitions, modest means, simplicity of background, and everyday life. But the most defining feature is this idea of equality based on numbers rather than merit. Here's Aristotle's internal logic. If equality is numerical, then the majority holds more authority simply because they are more in number. This is their form of justice. This chapter's big idea is that the principle of freedom produces a certain kind of equality, and that equality shapes the practices of the system. Just to also note that this is not necessarily Aristotle advocating passionately for popular rule or democracy, but he is arguing from their point of view regarding the arguments of those who support this type of rule. In chapter 3, Aristotle asks, what does it really mean for everyone to have an equal share? How should that equality be structured? He presents a dilemma. Should the population be divided so that the total property of one segment equals that of another, and each segment's vote counts proportionally? Or should we instead select an equal number of people from each segment regardless of property and let them decide? Then he presents two claims. Those who favor rule by the many say justice lies in whatever the majority decides. So Aristotle says this is basically a democracy. Those who prefer rule by those of greater means say justice lies in the decisions of those with greater resources. So Aristotle says this is basically oligarchy. And as you can expect, if you watch the earlier episodes, Aristotle says that both options are flawed. So no big surprise here. If justice is what the wealthiest decide, according to Aristotle, it leads to a kind of domination by the few. If justice is purely numerical, the many act in ways that can significantly disadvantage the wealthy few or competent few people. And Aristotle is extremely skeptical about the idea of the wisdom of the crowd. Perhaps this was the influence of his teacher Plato, or Plato's teacher Socrates. He says that decisions instead should reflect the interests of both groups, not just one, meaning that the resolutions supported by both should stand. Some neutral method must decide the outcome, such as a randomizing mechanism. What matters here is Aristotle's broader point, which we also touched upon in the previous episodes, is that both groups, rich, poor, less successful, more successful, those with more resources and those with less resources, define justice in terms of their own interests. But in reality, city is complicated. City is made of two parts. Richer, meaning those with more resources, and meaning those with fewer resources. You can flip this around and say that those who are more successful and those who are less successful. So it doesn't always have to be something about resources. Aristotle says that justice then should reflect the interests of all these groups, not just one. His criticism regarding democracy is that this democracy reflects the interests of the poor, and the oligarchy in turn reflects the interests of the rich. So it's not, both of those systems are not really just in that sense, according to Aristotle. And that's why he usually prefers polity, which we also discussed in the previous episode. Polity is a system where decision making is mostly based on middle class, middle ground. So the idea that middle class plays this balancing role between rich and the poor. Then Aristotle identifies four general forms of popular rule, and the best one that he thinks is the earliest and the simplest. I'm not going to go through all of those four rules, but I will briefly summarize the main ideas that Aristotle is laying out here. Here again, we see old man Aristotle becoming nostalgic about good old times. He says the simplest ones were the communities of farmers and herdsmen before we had all these labormen, craftsmen, artisans, scholars that came to dominate all the cities and made political life very complicated. Okay, why? Aristotle says that farmers and herdsmen lack leisure. They are working all the time. They are not interested in holding endless assemblies. They don't chase after advantages through public life. They tend not to envy the wealthy. Farming or herdsmanship encourages moderation. People have their work already and they just want stability, and they care less about ambitions in public life. So basically, they do not care as long as they are left alone to do their jobs. He says that the herding communities, just like farming communities, share very similar virtues, similar interests. They are accustomed to open air, physical strain, and a life that requires resilience. These qualities support a balanced form of governance. But he says that over time, as the compositions shifted away from farmers and herdsmen towards merchants and laborers, as cities became more complicated, as the population grew more, systems became more fragile and complicated. These later groups, they gather in cities and they have the leisure to attend assemblies frequently, and they can think about long-term goals. They can prioritize long-term gains over short-term gains. Remember that we talked about before why Aristotle thinks that the leisure is the basis of power, basis of governance. So the idea is that if you're not hungry all the time and if you have enough time to engage in leisure activities, then you can afford the time to participate in these discussions. You can think beyond tomorrow's needs. So these merchants or laborers, they can influence creating forms of popular rule that are thinner, less stable, and harder to maintain. In chapter 5, Aristotle says that creating a system is easier said than done, but actually preserving them is the hardest part once everything is established. So going to the gym and getting in shape is actually easier, but you also have to maintain it over long term. You have to keep training. So it's very similar idea here. Once you get in shape, you have to stay in shape. You have to work hard to stay in shape as well. Aristotle says that one must avoid everything that destabilizes the arrangement and instead enact laws, either written or unwritten, that reinforce stability. One of the interesting points he makes is about legal punishments. When public cases result in confiscations that become state property, citizens become eager to accuse others because they might personally benefit from the penalties. He recommends redirecting confiscated properties, confiscated material, confiscated wealth towards sacred purposes. The guilty still pay, but the other people, the poor people, lose incentive to target individuals for material gain. He warns against too many public suits because they fall disproportionately more on wealthier, more influential individuals, because poor usually want to attack and shame on those with more resources. And when that happens constantly, resentment grows and the trust system collapses. Next, he talks about compensation for participation. In large communities where many cannot attend assemblies without pay, financial pressures can push the system toward destructive practices like constant confiscations or exploitative fines. What is the solution he presents? Hold fewer gatherings, keep judicial sessions short, and structure compensation so essential functions are supported without burdening those who contribute significant time. If a city happens to have large sum of revenues, if a city is wealthy, let's say, Aristotle argues against distributing small funds to the poor very frequently, giving out checks, for example. Because he says that when that happens, money flows out, enthusiasm rises, expectations grows, and suddenly the community wants constant paycheck every day from the city council. He suggests accumulating funds until they can meaningfully lift individuals into stable livelihoods, meaning small plots of land or beginnings, beginnings in trade or farming or education. It is Aristotle's version of don't just simply give me a fish, but teach me how to fish so that I can survive. I can catch the fish and know how to do it myself in the future. I don't need you all the time. He notes that some communities help the poor by relocating groups to new areas or providing shared resources. Others combined offices so that both selection by lot and selection by choice could coexist. What he's trying to say with all of these ideas is that stability comes from reducing material desperation in people. Prosperity, even modest prosperity, helps preserve the order and stability. In chapter 7, Aristotle puts on his sociologist cap again. He splits the population into four groups: farmers, workers, merchants, and laborers. And then he does the same for military capacity. Those with horses, horsemen, and then heavy arms, light arms, and ships, naval power, basically. So where the land favors, where the conditions of the land favors horses, you naturally get strong upper class military groups in society. Where heavy arms dominate, slightly broader group participates. Similarly in light arms and naval powers as well. They belong to the many. So you kind of can see where this leads. When you have one small group of highly competent military force, let's say such as horsemen, then the system leans towards oligarchy according to Aristotle. However, when the city cannot rely on horsemen, either due to a lack of horses or let's say the city is located in mountainous area with very limited access, or it's located in the woods, within the woods, forests, jungles, then in these cases, cities rely on heavy arms or light arms, and you need regular citizenry to participate in these military groups so that the city can survive. Because they do not need specific trainings. For example, if they were to join horsemen, cavalrymen. But in the case of light arms or heavy arms, maybe okay, in the heavy arms they might need training. In any case, this is based on broader participation, citizen armies. When that happens, the result is that this also influences political arrangement in the city, according to Aristotle. Participation increases, and this also affects the political arrangement, whether city ends up as an oligarchy or democracy, according to Aristotle. So it's a very interesting explanation about how, if you look at the militaries, whether if your military armies is mostly dominated by highly skilled small group of elite cavalrymen versus when you rely on citizen armies, this also affects the political arrangement that the city ends up having. The overall point Aristotle is painting out here is that when the majority has more light armed or naval capacity in their military ranks, they can overpower smaller elite groups such as cavalrymen. He also mentions ways cities expand participation, allowing those who meet certain standards to join governing bodies. selecting capable individuals from outside existing structures, or giving significant offices public service obligations so that those excluded feel less resentment. By contributing visibly, the leaders earn goodwill, according to Aristotle. Aristotle ends Book 6 with a long inventory of offices necessary for a functioning city. What kind of offices should be there to manage different affairs of the city? This is the last topic that Aristotle touches upon in the Book 6. This is very practical and it's very technical rather than hardcore philosophy. He talks through what should supervise markets, towns, harbors, the countryside, agreements, contracts, records, prisoners, military matters, revenues, audits, sacred sites, festivals, and many more. Here you can see Aristotle is sometimes very weird in a good way. At some point, he will extensively talk about human nature, as we did in the first part of this series, why humans can be considered political animals. But then he can just go into discussing, how many judges should exist in a democracy, or whether two is enough, or whether in certain scenarios or certain seasons or certain days, six or seven is more preferred. Very technical little details that doesn't really affect the ultimate argument that you may want to lay out as your grand theory of politics if you are Aristotle. I won't dwell on too much technical breakdown here. It seems also like the Aristotle himself treats this almost as a secondary importance. He also runs them over very quickly, but I don't know, it might also be the editing differences here. Remember that when we talk about Aristotle's politics, it is not the case that Aristotle intended this to be a separate book to be released in the future generations. Most scholars agree that what we call as Aristotle's politics or Aristotle's ethics or Aristotle's metaphysics is basically some of his students taking notes in one of the lectures, editing it, passing them around, gathering them around from other students, and that's how these writings mostly survive to us to this day. Because Aristotle was kind of a lecturer in the modern sense, universal lecturer, where he would go to the academia that Plato founded and then give lectures about different topics: metaphysics, politics, ethics, zoology, physics, and everything. So he wasn't necessarily just a philosopher. Yes, if you ask, is Aristotle a philosopher or a scientist? Both. Because back then there was no such distinction between philosophy and science. And that persisted even to almost the last century. If you ask Isaac Newton whether you are a scientist or a philosopher, he would say, I'm a philosopher. I'm engaged in natural philosophy. That's what people used to call natural sciences back in the day. They used to call natural sciences as natural philosophy. But anyway, without losing the thread of the topic, let's go back to the Aristotle's Politics, last chapter. So he treats these last considerations almost secondary. What matters here most is that his organizing principle. A community requires both necessary offices for basic survival and also higher offices for good arrangement. Because as cities grow more complicated, as communities grow, as population grow, and also complexity also grows. And that's where you need specialization to attend to different matters in city life. Large communities need more, smaller communities need less. Some offices can be combined, others must remain separate to prevent resentment or abuse. Aristotle closes the chapter 8, which is the end of book 6, by categorizing election supervising roles. Some are aristocratic, some oligarchic, some popular. Each type of system uses a different method for choosing its leaders. And with that, book 6 ends. I think what Aristotle offers in book 6 is mostly a study of human tendencies, how work shapes behavior, how scarcity affects judgment, how equality can fracture into different definitions, and how stability requires more than procedures. Sometimes Aristotle says that stability requires a population where everyday habits align with the structure of the regime. The key point to note here is that Aristotle isn't romantic about any of these, and he doesn't passionately argue about one or the other. So it's more about compromises. Political life is more about compromises, choosing the least of the evils. And in the book 6, Aristotle is describing what actually happens when human beings try to live together under shared rules, what breaks and what doesn't break. If there is one thing to take away from this book 6 is that structure of governance must match the character of the people. Aristotle would say that you can't force a system onto a population whose habits, aspirations, or circumstances contradict it. Stability usually depends on alignment. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these episodes, make sure to like and subscribe on YouTube or follow and leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can find this show on all major platforms, and for daily content or messaging, follow me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. And if you missed the earlier episodes, go check them out as well, because the concepts and theories that I have discussed in this video builds upon the discussions that we had laid upon in the previous chapters. Alongside these solo episodes, I've had some guest conversations as well, and I will have more in the future. I've had one recently with Roman Polsku on AI and simulation theory, with Massimo Pigliucci on Stoicism, Stephen Hicks on Enlightenment, Spencer Greenberg on Rationality and Decision Making, and very recently Anil Seth on The Science of Consciousness. Check them out if you're interested. Until next time then, bye.